Disc 2.
John Brown, the Man Who Ended Slavery. Review of John Brown, Abolitionist, by David S. Reynolds. The Atlantic, May 2005. When Abraham Lincoln gave an audience to Harriet Beecher Stowe, he's supposed to have greeted her by saying that she was the little woman who had started this great war. That fondly related anecdote illustrates the persistent tendency to parson Weemsishness in our culture. It was not at all the tear-jerking sentiment of Uncle Tom's Cabin that catalyzed the war between the states. It was rather the blood-spilling intransigence of John Brown, field-tested on the pitiless Kansas prairies and later deployed at Harpers Ferry. And John Brown was a man whom Lincoln assiduously disowned, until the time came when he himself was compelled to adopt the policy of war to the knife and the knife to the hilt, as partisans of the slavocracy had hitherto been too proud of saying. David Reynolds sets himself to counter several misapprehensions about the pious old buzzard. Brown, I mean, not Lincoln. Among these are the impressions that he was a madman, that he was a homicidal type, and that his assault on a federal arsenal was foredoomed and quixotic. The critical thing here is context, and the author succeeds admirably in showing that Brown, far from being a crazed fanatic, was a serious legatee of the English and American revolutions who anticipated the Emancipation Proclamation and all that has ensued from it. Until 1850, perhaps, the peculiar institution of slavery might have had a chance of perpetuating itself indefinitely by compromise, but the exorbitance and arrogance of the slave power forbade this accommodation. Not content with preserving their own domain in its southeastern redoubt, the future Confederates insisted on extending their chattel system into new territories and on implicating the entire Union in their system. The special symbol of this hubris was the Fugitive Slave Act, which legalized the recovery of human property from free states. The idea of secession or separation first arose among abolitionists confronted with this monstrous imposition. Men like William Lloyd Garrison took their text from the book of Isaiah, describing the U.S. Constitution as a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, and exhorting their supporters to come out now and be separate. This hermeneutic rejectionism, incidentally, is identical to that preached today by Ian Paisley and the Presbyterian hardliners of Northern Ireland. The proto-libertarian and anarchist Lysander Spooner argued that nowhere did the Constitution explicitly endorse slavery. It was for defenders of the values of 1776 and 1789 to help the slaves overthrow an illegitimate tyranny. In this, he had the support of the Republican Frederick Douglass, who also wanted the United States to live up to its founding documents rather than to nullify or negate them. Meanwhile, the Democrats were unashamed advocates of the extension of slavery, and Lincoln was willing to submit to one humiliation after another in order, as he never tired of saying, to preserve the Union. John Brown could effortlessly outdo Garrison in any biblical condemnation of slavery. He could also easily surpass Lysander Spooner in his zeal to encourage and arm what the authorities called servile insurrection. He strongly agreed with Douglass that the Union should be preserved and not dissolved, but he was incapable of drawing up any balance sheet between preservation and gradual emancipation, because he saw quite plainly that the balance was going the other way, and that the slave power was influencing and subordinating the North rather than the other way about. Thus, despite his commitment to the Union, he was quite ready to regard the federal government as an enemy. Originally a New Englander, and possibly a Mayflower descendant, Brown appeared to adopt and exemplify the adamant Calvinism of Jonathan Edwards, with his strict insistence on predestination and the elect and his vivid belief in eternal punishment for sinners. Reynolds gives some hair-raising examples of the culture of corporal punishment and cruel austerity that ruled Brown's own upbringing and the raising of his 20 children. And it is easy to see how such a combination of dogma and discipline might have given rise to the persistent rumour that he was partly unhinged. More than one of his sons became mentally disturbed. However, the story of his longer evolution makes this speculation a highly unsafe one. For all his attachment to Calvinist orthodoxy, Brown felt himself very close to the transcendental school of Emerson and Thoreau. He formed important friendships in this circle and relied on a secret Six committee of supporters in Massachusetts who stood ready to provide money and even weapons for his projects. He can hardly have been unaware of the religious heterodoxy of this group, and when it came to the no less critical matter of choosing his immediate entourage of radical would-be guerrillas, he readily included Jews, Indians, Painite deists, and agnostics. Most of all, however, he insisted on including blacks. This at once distinguished him from most abolitionists, who preferred to act for the slaves rather than with them. But Brown had made a friendship with a slave boy at the age of 12 and would appear to have undergone a Huck Finn-like experience in the recognition of a common humanity. Later, he studied the life and tactics of Nat Turner and of the rebellious Haitian Toussaint Louverture, and decided that a full-scale revolt of the oppressed rather than any emancipation from above was the need of the hour. I was very much interested to learn that his other great hero was Oliver Cromwell, whose new model army had swept away profane kingship in England and established a Puritan regime. The revisionist view of Cromwell as a liberator rather than a regicide was the work of Thomas Carlyle in the 1840s, and a result of Carlyle's friendship with Emerson. The American writer Joel Tyler Headley recycled Carlyle, as Reynolds phrases it, for the American mass market, portraying Cromwell as an ancestor of the American Revolution, as well as a synthesizer of religion, republicanism, and violence. It seems probable that Brown got his introduction to Cromwell from Headley rather than directly from Carlyle. I cannot easily imagine him esteeming the Carlyle who apostatized from Calvinism, let alone the Carlyle who, in justifying slavery in the West Indies in 1850, published Occasional Discourse on the Nigger Question. Reynolds does not discuss this awkward paradox. Reynolds focuses on the three most sanguinary and dramatic episodes in Brown's career: the engagements at Pottawatomie and Osawatomie in Kansas, and the culminating battle at Harpers Ferry. To read this extended account is to appreciate that Brown, far from being easily incited to rage and rashness, was capable of playing a very long game. He was naturally drawn to Kansas because it had become the battleground state in a union that was half slave and half free. The pro-slavery settlers and infiltrators from Missouri were determined to colonize the territory and to pack its polling booths, and in this they often had the indulgence of decrepit and cowardly presidents, including Franklin Pierce. Until the appearance of Brown and his men on the scene, the slave power had had things mostly its own way, and was accustomed to using any method it saw fit. After the murder of the abolitionist editor Elijah Lovejoy, and especially after the famous assault on Senator Charles Sumner by Representative Preston Brooks, Brown decided on a reprisal raid and slew several leading pro-slavery Kansans in the dead of night. There's no question that this represented only a small installment of payback, though Reynolds nervously characterizes it as terrorism and spends a great deal of time and ink in partly rationalizing the deed. The superfluity of this is easily demonstrated. Not only had the slaveholders perpetrated the preponderance of atrocities, and with impunity at that, but they had begun to boast that Northerners and New Englanders were congenitally soft and altogether lacking in chivalric and soldierly qualities. What could be more apt than that they should encounter John Brown, careless of his own safety and determined to fill the ungodly with the fear of the risen Christ? Every cavalier should meet such a Roundhead. After Pottawatomie, the swagger went out of the Southerners, and after the more conventional fighting at Osawatomie and Brown's cool-headed raid to liberate a group of slaves and take them all the way to Canada, they came to realize that they were in a hard fight. Furthermore, their sulphurous reaction to this discovery and their stupid tendency to paint Brown as an agent of the Republican Party made it harder and harder for the invertebrate Lincolnians to keep the issue of slavery under control. In his work in Kansas and his long toil on the Underground Railroad, Brown was essentially mounting a feint. He knew that subscribers and supporters in New England would give him money and even arms for these limited and shared objectives. But he wanted to divert the money and the arms to the larger purpose of making any further Lincolnian retreats and compromises impossible. For years he'd been studying the keystone town of Harpers Ferry, situated at the confluence of the Shenandoah and the Potomac, and handily placed for the potentially guerrilla-friendly Allegheny Mountains. Reynolds shows that the strategic design was not as quixotic as one has often been led to believe. This northwestern portion of Virginia was generally sympathetic to abolition and to the Union. Indeed, its later cleaving into the new free state of West Virginia in 1862 is the only secession from that epoch that still survives. The fall months were the harvest season, when disaffection among overdriven slaves was more general, and the national political climate was becoming more febrile and polarized. Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry failed badly, of course, but the courage and bearing he demonstrated after his humiliating defeat were of an order to impress his captors, who announced that, far from being mad, their prisoner was lucid and eloquent as well as brave. The slander of insanity was circulated by the weaker members of the anti-slavery camp, who cringingly sought to avoid the identification with Brown that the Southern press had opportunistically made. By falling for its own propaganda, however, and in the general panic that followed the botched insurrection, the South persuaded itself that war was inevitable, and that Lincoln, who had denounced Brown in his campaign against Douglas and in his famous speech at Cooper Union, was a Brownite at heart. The history of the 6 years after 1859 is the history not so much of Brown's prophecy as of the self-fulfilling prophecy of his enemies. As Reynolds hauntingly words it, the officer who supervised the capture of Brown was Robert E. Lee. Lee's retreat from the decisive Battle of Gettysburg would pass over the same road that Brown took to Harper's Ferry on the night of his attack. The lieutenant who demanded Brown's surrender was J.E.B. Stuart, later Lee's celebrated cavalry officer. Among the officers who supervised at Brown's hanging was Thomas Jackson, soon to become the renowned Stonewall. Among the soldiers at Brown's execution was a dashing Southern actor, John Wilkes Booth. If this does not vindicate Brown's view that all had been predestined by the Almighty before the world was made, it nonetheless does do something to the hair on the back of one's neck. As do the words finally uttered in Lincoln's second inaugural about every drop of blood drawn by the lash being repaid by the sword, and the utter destruction of the piled-up wealth of those who live by the bondsman's toil. The final reckoning with slavery and secession was described by Lincoln himself as one great John Brown raid into the South, and was on a scale that would have brought a wintry smile to the stern face of Oliver Cromwell. The Marseillaise of that crusade, the battle hymn of the Republic, which first appeared, as did many other important documents of the Brown-Emerson alliance, in the pages of this magazine, was an adaptation of the foot soldier's song about old Osawatomie Brown. One reserves the term quixotic for hopeless causes. Harper's Ferry was the first defeat, as it was also the seminal victory, of a triumphant cause, precisely because it sounded a trumpet that could never call retreat. So much for the apocalyptic and, if you like, transcendental influence of Brown. Reynolds, building on the earlier work of Merrill Peterson, traces another gentler influence that may be no less consequential. Almost all whites in that epoch feared almost all blacks, and many blacks resented the condescension of the anti-slavery organizations, most especially those groups that wanted to free them and then deport them to Africa. John Brown shared his life with slaves and rewrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution so as to try to repair the hideous wrong that had been done to them. In issuing these documents, by the way, he exculpated himself from any ahistorical charge of terrorism, which by definition offers nothing programmatic. The record shows that admiration for Brown was intense, widespread and continuous, from Douglas to Du Bois and beyond. Our world might be a good deal worse than it is, had not numberless African Americans, from that day to this, taken John Brown as proof that fraternity and equality, as well as liberty, were feasible things and could be exemplified by real people.